It is 8:41 Newstalk Sauga 960 Raw. Mike Richards, in which we find, the world still sort of slightly turned upside down. But I might also argue that with some of the incredibly effective protests, very peaceful, very powerful, in fact, being more powerful because of just how civil it is. It shows the impact of what true protests can do. That maybe it's not upside down. Maybe it's being turned to the way that it's supposed to be. I mean, there is an argument for that, and I think in a lot of ways, as scary as the rioting first was, that I think the actual true protest, the actual attempt to turn society in a more fair manner, I think is historically significant. And of course, with that comes what will be some real legal issues, and of course, that's what people are talking about today. It is not about the it's not about the NHL Summer Hub Tournament or whatever you want to call it. The NBA playing at Disney World. This is simply, quite honestly, not that substantial in our lives right now. Sports isn't number one. It's this. And when we get into legal issues, you only want to talk to one person. That is our good friend, Jeff Manishen from Ross McBride. Good morning, Jeff.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Dave.
Good morning.
Well, we see this from afar, and so we take a look at the American legal system, and we think, well, that obviously is very different than ours. I mean, what kind of issues do we have? But it's my understanding that even coming down from some of our higher courts, when it comes to things like racial profiling, are we now changing the way in which we are seeing that implicated or implemented in Canada?
I don't know if I'd necessarily say the way that we're changing it. I think the way I'd choose to phrase it is it continues to be a real issue. So by way of an example only, if we go back on the matter of racial profiling, you may remember Dee Brown played for the Raptors many years back, and he was stopped and charged with a drinking and driving offense, and there was issues raised at trial that it was an arbitrary detention. There was no real cause for him being stopped other than the fact that he was Black. And that was argued at trial, and the defense put it forward, and the judge didn't find it. And if I recall it right, the judge literally said to the defense, "You should apologize to the officer for even suggesting it." Well, the matter went to the Court of Appeal, and ultimately they found a basis to say, look, there was strong evidence of racial profiling. And since that time, there have been a number of decisions where that's been identified. Most recent, the Supreme Court of Canada, just May of last year in a case called Lee, what they found, it was a situation in which the police officers went into the backyard. There were 4 Black guys, 1 Asian guy. No basis to really go in, no warrant to search, no basis to detain. But ultimately, they demanded the guys identify themselves, asked if one guy what's in his bag. The guy took off. They ultimately grabbed him. They found a gun there and ultimately found some drugs. What the court found is, look, the reasonable person in the position of these accused, recognizing that the history has shown strong problems in racial profiling, over attention to people of minorities. It's been identified, Human Rights Commission, all kinds of other studies would have reason to believe I'm being discriminated against and I'm being arbitrarily detained. There will be evidence out. And they recognize this has gone back and established pretty much what's called judicial notice. It's so well established that the reasonable person who took the time to research it would find there's really no dispute about it. All kinds of studies, but the key is, Mike, going back decades and decades.
So, and this just sort of verifies the actual claim about the imbalance that we've had in our legal system and with those who actually conduct themselves as officers of the law. So it is systemic. I think in this case, could you not say that is a very accurate word for what has happened in our society?
Systemic is the word, and I've seen it mentioned on TV. I think a couple people from the States used the phrase, "Oh, it's just a few bad apples." Well, that's something that's recognized there in terms of studies too, but that's just really an excuse. That's a way that can undermine public confidence in the way in which police do their jobs. And that clearly it's not a few bad apples, it's not a bad basket. It may well be problems in the orchard, and the orchard goes across Canadian and American lines. And that isn't to say that the majority of police officers show this kind of tendency, but on the other hand, is it problematic enough to pick up on that word, Mike, that is systemic? Yeah, that's the word that's been well accepted.
Jeff, we had tremendous feedback from your last last guest appearance here on our show last week, and I had a couple different emails, and we've talked about it at times between now and then. As far as the case against the 4 officers in Minneapolis, one of the questions I was asked about, which obviously I have no idea about, that's why you're here, is how did the 4 officers finally get tried in court? Is it separate? All 4 are separate? Are they all together? I know the one main cop has the second-degree charge against him. He has the highest charge of the 4. But the 3 are part of that same grouping. Could you kind of explain to people like me how exactly that will work?
Sure, and I think the best I'll do for Dave is use Canadian principles, because sometimes there are variations in the States, and so I won't claim to know
Fair enough.
fine details there. But generally, when you have people involved in what could be considered to be a joint enterprise, something in which a number of people are participating, they're normally going to be tried together. Because we don't want to have multiplicity of proceedings. We also don't want to have inconsistent verdicts. I mean, theoretically, if they were severed, you could have officer number 1 blaming officer number 2. In the case of Chauvin, it doesn't really play out that well at all. But I would say this, the likelihood, as far as I would be concerned, would be one trial involving multiple officers. And we've seen it. I think in the Rodney King case, for example, years back, the officers were all tried together. And there are other cases in which multiple co-accused are tried together. So I would say it would likely be a trial together.
Now, what is that trial going to look like? Of the almost a decade type trials, and now that we have so much media and social media, everything is so amplified, even more so than it was with the OJ case, which I think of my lifetime probably was the biggest of the television cases. Is this going to be similar? Are we walking down a similar road with this like we did with the OJ case?
Couple of features on that one, Mike. Number 1, what's the law in terms of the state of Minnesota to have a trial that could be televised or not? And it may well be that's not something that's permitted. I think one of the most interesting questions is the concept of having a fair trial, given the extent of pretrial publicity. The concept of trying to determine whether a jury in Minneapolis, for example, could decide this case fairly and impartially. But by comparison, for example, only Harvey Weinstein was tried in New York. And there was a ton of publicity there. And there were issues certainly raised in the course of the jury selection process to try and find out in advance, not simply had the potential juror heard or known anything about the case, but would he or she have formed any opinion on the case, where they would have effectively prejudged it based on the pretrial publicity. So there are questions that can be permitted of jurors to determine whether or not they can in fact maintain impartiality in terms of deciding the case only on the evidence. For the case in Minneapolis for the death of Mr. Floyd, that's a very real issue. That one, Mike, in some ways is one of the most compelling features from a legal standpoint. How can you assure these people get a fair trial?
Length of the trial. I know this is only a prediction, but this almost seems like this could be a marathon trial, doesn't it, Jeff?
I don't know about that, Dave, because remember that the issues in the case are going to be what did they do and what was their intent. Well, factually, it's not events that went on for months. It's not a case in which there's multiple wiretaps and you're trying to show some complex conspiracy where you're linking evidence together. Rather, what you have is a factual scenario where what are going to be your witnesses? I would expect you're going to have the civilian witnesses who were there at the scene. You're going to have the potentially, if there are any other police witnesses, whatever there is in terms of video, body camera evidence, anything in that regard. You might get into issues of use of force training. Yep. And then you're going to be into the realm of potential defense evidence. I saw the lawyer for one of the accused do an extensive interview on TV the other day talking about his client's version of events. I have to say to you, that's unusual. That's not the kind of thing that, for my practice, I do. Because remember that the information I got from my client, I got confidentially. I got in what's called solicitor-client privilege.
Right.
If I'm going on TV telling everybody his story, effectively, it could be said I'm waiving that privilege. Could you even see a scenario in which some prosecutor might subpoena me to testify about the things he told me because I've shared them with everybody? And yet the other way to do it is he's thinking, hey, I want to affect public opinion by getting my guy's story out early. And then you get into issues of who's trying to manipulate the media which way.
Well, I couldn't imagine, the emotion that would be in that courtroom. I mean, you have been there beforehand. You've had cases where I think you've been on both sides of those tables. And, you know, for someone like myself, you know, the only thing I can think of is going to be movie or TV related. So I'll always go back to something like To Kill a Mockingbird, which are some of the most incredible scenes from any movie of any genre. But because of the content of what that movie was about and the trial was about, you may see some of that emotion in that courtroom. So how do you handle that? Number one, if you're the defense and the prosecutors, because it's obviously in that headspace. I mean, how difficult is that going to be?
I guess the way that I'd phrase it, Mike, is through experience, you maintain a measure of detachment. You maintain a measure of objectivity or professionalism. And so what you do is you have to really distance yourself from the emotional components, and you focus, as far as the personal emotional components, and you focus on what are the issues in the case and how most effectively present them. On the other hand, I can tell you that at the proverbial moment of truth, when a jury is about to return a verdict on a murder case, or really any case, but certainly a murder case, and a murder case that's got a lot of attention, the tension and emotion in the courtroom is crushing. It's far more than you see in a movie because it's real. And everybody feels it. Counsel do, the judge does, obviously the parties do, family does. That one, it's impossible to distance yourself from. You cannot help but feel emotionally, really powerfully affected when that, how do you find the accused guilty or not guilty? I've done lots. That one, you never get entirely used to it because it's so real.
Well, the sounds made at the OJ trial when it was the not guilties, the sounds that the family made, I'll remember. I'll take them to the grave. That anguish, that sound that humans make is really difficult. I think emotionally it's difficult.
And you know, the other way that you sometimes have to look at it too is, to some extent, whatever happens in the courtroom doesn't bring the deceased back to life, and whatever you do to the accused only provides a moderate measure of comfort or closure. It still doesn't replace the person. So the justice system, and it's the same, you could say, in the same kind of thing in a civil case. If you suffer motor vehicle accidents, significant brain injury that affects you the rest of your life and the caregivers around you affected, how does money adequately compensate for the fact you've lost the person that you were and the people lost the person that they loved? So the justice system should never really be viewed as, we'll characterize it as a compensation. It doesn't, and it can't make up for loss.
Yeah, and that is certainly the truth. We have so much more. I know we talk about this. This went by in about 5 minutes. I mean, they usually do, but this went extra
Absolutely.
fast. So you know what? We'll do this again. In fact, I think we should do this on a regular basis if you do have the time, because as I said, the response, I mean, it's always great, but it was kind of over the top with just what people and what we don't know, you know. And I think you do it in such an eloquent, in such in a way that we can all understand what's going on. It's a gift for us. So if you have the time, we certainly would love to do this again, because there's certainly lots to talk about.
Sure, Mike. The courts aren't opening up again until at the earliest July the 6th. So for me, in the next number of weeks, it happens to be a good time to be able to chat. And I like sharing this. I think one of the best things a lawyer can do from a public standpoint is inform.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens on that segment. Thank you so much, my friend. We'll talk to you again soon, and
Okay.
Thank you so much for this morning.
You're most welcome. Good chatting, guys.
That is Jeff Manishen from Ross McBride, as Dave says, the super lawyer, and he is super great when he comes on this show, as you have responded to. So we thank Jeff for that time.